Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today I'll be having a great conversation with Jeffrey Bewley. Jeffrey is the Executive Director of Genetic Programs and Innovation at Holstein USA. And we're going to be having a great discussion on one of my favorite topics, which is technology, innovation, and data in the dairy industry. I know his insights go far beyond just the U.S. market. Jeffrey is well known in the dairy world and the genetic world as well. Jeffrey and I first met, I believe it was almost 3 years ago now, at a conference that I was at, and he was one of the speakers. And I had a lot of respect for what he was saying and his depth of knowledge, and was always hoping to get him on this podcast. So I'm really excited for this interview with Jeffrey. Well, today on the AgCulture Podcast, I had the privilege of welcoming Jeffrey Bewley to the show. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here. You are the Executive Director of Genetic Programs and Innovation at Holstein Association USA. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I want to start out with going backward in time. What was the spark of interest in blending technology, genetics, and dairy farm performance that really got you into the space that you're in today?
I grew up working with my grandfather on his dairy. It was my maternal grandfather. And when I was probably about 10 years old, my dad, who was an accountant by training and ended up being a CFO of a couple organizations before he retired, introduced me to spreadsheets. I don't know why he introduced me to spreadsheets when I was that young, but I immediately thought, wouldn't it be neat to put some of the herd records into a spreadsheet? So I started building spreadsheets when I was 10 or 11 years old for the herd. This was before I even knew about things like Dairy Comp or PC Dart or herd management software programs. And I just started building these spreadsheets. So it's always been an interest of mine is data, and specifically data related to dairy and basketball, actually. So I guess I was always leaning that way, because even when I was a kid, I always read the box scores and looked at all of the stats for players after every game that I watched. So I've always kind of had that lean toward statistics and numbers.
That's great. And that's not something you hear every day of technology person getting into technology with spreadsheets. So I love spreadsheets too, so I'm right there with you. I understand you completely. What was there a moment or a challenge on the farm that you were dealing with at that point that really got you hooked into how it could actually transform how you looked at that challenge or problem on the farm?
Not at that point. I was just a kid playing with data, I guess, at that point. And, over the years, things morph and things change. And actually, specifically on technology, I really wasn't that into technology for the dairy industry until my PhD program. And during my PhD at Purdue, I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I was thinking about doing a decision economics tool. So I wanted to look at the economics of some decision on a farm, and ultimately landed on trying to look at the economics of technology adoption. And my advisor, Dr. Mike Schutz, encouraged me to also do a couple of studies with technologies in addition to just the economic modeling study. And then that was kind of the turning point for getting involved in technologies. I had the opportunity to be involved with some of the very first accelerometers that were used to monitor behaviors of cows, and to work on some computer vision stuff back during my PhD program. And it just started me down this route. And that was about 20 years ago now. And really, if you look backwards, there wasn't a lot of technology like we have today 20 years ago. So I've kind of gotten to follow it from the very early stages to now where we have a lot of very mature technologies, and of course still new technologies coming on.
Yeah, that's a really unique perspective that you've had, and that was one thing I really appreciated when I heard you speak about that. But you look at things, I'm guessing, as kind of a data analytics scientist brain, and you're looking now at genetic programs and innovation with Holstein Association. So how do you personally view the data that you're working on, maybe differently than what a dairy producer, conventional breeding company would look at?
I kind of found myself in this space of exploration of technology. So I'm always looking at it with today's hat on, but also looking forward to where might this be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And that may be very different than the way that a dairy producer would look at a technology, because a dairy producer needs to get a return on investment in that technology within a reasonable time frame. Whereas I'm going to be working with some technologies that might not provide any return on investment for a number of years because they're early stage, or even sometimes they're so early stage they don't pan out. They don't end up working. But I think that's the biggest difference, is that some of the things I'm looking at are more down the road as opposed to today. And within that, the same applies for genetic evaluations, that there's a lot of data that's produced by the technologies that we have on farms today that has potential for providing additional phenotypic information that we can use to do genetic evaluations with. So, for example, if we look at something like automated body condition scoring, well, then we have a phenotype for body condition score to be able to select for cows that maintain their body condition instead of losing body condition. Or if we have a new metric for lameness or locomotion that comes from some of these technologies, then that can be used to develop tools and genetic evaluations for minimizing the risk of lameness within a cow from a genetic perspective.
Now, for those in the audience that don't know the difference between genotype and phenotype, could you quick make that description?
So phenotype is what we see expressed in the animal. Phenotype would be like milk production is a very easy phenotype to think about. And so we know that this particular cow gives 30,000 pounds of milk, for example. Well, part of that is because she's genetically set up to produce that much milk, but part of it is because of everything else that happens in that animal's life, to how she was raised as a calf, to how she was raised at a heifer, to her housing conditions today, and the way she's fed and managed. And so that's the rest of that equation. So phenotype is the genetics plus everything else that's happened to that animal. In genetics, it's called environment. It's all lumped into one general category, but both of them end up affecting the performance of the animal.
That's very good description. So with that, I've seen several charts thrown around in the dairy industry at different conferences recently. There's been huge acceleration in different phenotypical performance indicators genetically. What does that stem from in your mind? Where does that really taken into effect?
As far as the genetic progress that we're making today?
Yeah, yep.
There are a number of factors in it. I mean, as in science, we always build upon what our predecessors have done. And so some of that goes back to the basic principles of data collection when the DHI system was developed, or some basic genetic evaluation strategies that were established 30 or 40 years ago. But there have been some big changes in the last few years that have really increased the acceleration of genetic progress. And one of those changes is definitely having genomic data to supplement the phenotypic data used in genetic evaluations. That's provided a lot more information about animals a lot sooner. And that has also enabled, particularly when coupled with IVF and embryo transfer technology, to be able to really shorten the generation interval. So we can get really, the next generation isn't that much. The last generation isn't that much older than the next generation. So, because we're using young bulls on young heifers, then the generation interval is so much shorter that it allows for genetic progress to occur much faster.
Now, going back, what you were talking about with data and data quality, collection, structure, and farmer trust, what are the biggest hurdles that you see today, and how do you think we should work to overcome them on those specific areas of data quality, collection, and structure, and farmer trust?
There are still quite a few challenges with how we manage and handle the data on dairy farms. One of the big challenges that we have is that we tend to have a lot of data sitting in different silos that don't communicate well with each other. That is a limit to how far we can go with data when we have one piece of data that doesn't talk to the other piece of data. Strategies for trying to improve that, and there are platforms being developed to help with that, but that's not an easy task. And it's not technically hard, but it's politically hard because every company has to decide, yes, I want to share data with another company, and then there's programming time involved with that. So that's a real cost that each company has to think about. So it's a complex issue, and underlying all of that is data ownership and data security. So who owns the data, and is it secure? Are we making sure that it doesn't get into a place that we don't want it to go? So all of that's an important piece of this equation also. But I think a lot of this lack of crosstalk between different sources of data is one of our biggest issues. And then there tends to be where if somebody says their technology does measure a particular metric, that we take them for their word. But in some cases, it's not really measuring that, or it's not measuring it very well. So sometimes I think there needs to be a bit more validation done to show that these technologies are indeed measuring what they say that they're measuring.
Okay. And I know you're involved in a collaboration with Western Kentucky University and have a dairy innovation center there where you test out a lot of the hardware and some of the programs as well. Talk to us about that experience and some of the things that you've learned through that collaboration.
So we call it the WKU Smart Holstein Lab. It's a collaboration between Holstein Association and Western Kentucky University, where we explore technologies for the dairy industry and look at how they actually work on farm and how we can implement them and whether or not they're useful. We provide a lot of feedback to our collaborating companies to help them refine and develop those technologies. So some of them are mature technologies. Some of them are very immature. They may be version 1 or version 2 of a system that's at our farm. So there's different levels of technologies that we're working with there. And actually, we are developing our own technology now. Holstein Association that's focused on doing linear trait evaluation using 3D cameras. So we call it the Build a Better Cow system, where we can measure things like stature and udder depth and teat placement or leg set, so that we can use that information to provide us more accurate, perhaps, information for genetic evaluations regarding the conformation traits. So we've learned a lot. I mean, at this point in time, between the work that I've done there and some other roles in the past, I've worked with over 50 different technologies. And it's not always fun because they don't always work, but it is fun when they do get there. And I'll say at the Smart Holstein Lab, there's never been a day where every technology's worked. So there's always something that's not quite working the way that it's supposed to. So there's a lot of babysitting and patience involved, particularly with some of these early stage technologies. One of the things that I've learned that I think is extremely important is that some data might be interesting, but it's not actually useful. So
that's a great point.
Data geek, sometimes that's hard for me to accept, but I see some of these systems where I go in and I look at it and I think, wow, it's really neat what they've done here from a technical perspective, but there's probably not a lot that I can actually do about that. So that means maybe the use case is lacking sometimes. And hard to justify the cost of something that you can't take an action on that provides a return on that investment. So that's one of the most important things that I've learned. It has to be something that's biologically meaningful that we can take action on. I've learned that technologies definitely don't always work the way that they're supposed to work, and there are technical hurdles that we have to work with. That's part of what we're trying to do, is work on those things. So I'm intentionally putting myself in that position, but I think it's important for farmers to understand when they're looking at a technology to talk to existing users to make sure that the technology really does work on farm. And some of these companies, the startups in particular, they release a technology and they may not understand simple things like how big the cows are that we work with, or how dirty and wet the environment is. So the technology struggle early on because they haven't fully accounted for those kinds of things.
Do you have any disaster stories around that?
I have a lot of disaster stories.
It sounds like you had a little frustration in that comment. So
there are sometimes there's frustration, and just little things like rodents on farms can be a problem. Rodents it might be mice, it might be raccoons. They can be a challenge, or a lightning strike. We had a lightning strike earlier this year that fried a bunch of our technology, and that was a big problem for us. Sometimes we've had devices that like wearable devices that the tags just don't stay together, and they fall off. Part of the technology falls off, and it's sitting in the manure alley trying to read, and that's not very useful. So there's little things like that happen. Now, I'll say that the mature technologies, these problems don't happen. Like some of the devices that are out there now have been around for a decade or more, and we're using tag number 1,500,000 or whatever. So they work through those things. So it's not the case for all technologies. Just some of the early stage ones, they still have their growing pains to work through.
No, in your time, like you said, you've been in this area of technology development for 20 years now. In your time, have you seen a progression in how that data is utilized? And I know from across the dairy industry in the U.S. and globally too, a lot of herds are managed at a herd or pen level, right? So they're shooting for the average of either that pen or that herd, and that's what they're managing toward. Do you see that changing as more sensory technology and other hardware devices are available to track individual data on animals to be able to manage to the animal rather than the herd, or you think we're still a long ways from really being able to do that effectively?
I think there's a lot of cases where it's enabled it to go back to looking at the individual animal more. So like these tags, the wearable devices that we have, which again, that's very mature technology, nothing new now, but they really, they're watching each cow 24 hours a day. And so even, growing up on a small dairy, we couldn't watch every cow 24 hours a day. These are watching 24 hours a day. So that really allows for individual attention. And particularly when it comes to taking actions like breeding decisions or treatment decisions, it provides a lot of great information about them. Now, sometimes there's other things that the decision is at the group level, and maybe you can't make an individual cow decision because we're in a group setting. But there's also value in looking at that data at the aggregate level and looking at the pen average. So it could be that a pen average change in rumination time or eating time or lying time might be just as valuable as knowing that an individual animal changed for those metrics.
Do you think the industry itself and the university recommendations and industry recommendations have gotten there to be able to utilize that fully?
It depends on the question. I think it depends on the technology. So, like, again, I keep going back to them because they're the most widely adopted. But the wearable technologies, I think, particularly for estrus detection, we know exactly what they do and can't do. And they're really good at what they're supposed to do. There's a lot of them that are really good. And for the health technologies. I think there's a lot of value there. People know how to use those and how to help them identify cows that are off feed, for example. There's probably sometimes some opportunities still for improvements in some of those algorithms. Disease is complex, so there's sometimes more false positives or false negatives than what we might want to see with some of those technologies. But I think an important factor to remember there, I talked a lot about false positives and false negatives at a meeting once, and a large dairyman stopped me and said, "I don't think you're thinking about this the right way." He said, "You really need to think about that right now. I have a pen of 500 fresh cows, and that system might tell me I need to go look at 50 of them. And I know that there aren't 50 of them that really have a problem. Maybe there's only 10 or 15 that have a problem. But that enables me to look at only 50 of them instead of having to look at 500 of them. So there's a huge time savings in that. And that's where I get the value, not necessarily that it has to be 100% correct that this cow is indeed sick." And so I think that was a really important lesson for me to hear from that dairy producer, that there's more to it than just, is it perfectly right all the time? It can still be valuable, even if it's not right and not 100% right. And I use that, and I think about technologies a lot. As a scientist, we want everything to be as close to perfect as we can. But in reality, perfection oftentimes is the enemy of progress. And we can try to get it perfect, but if it's 80% there, maybe that's good enough, because before we were only 20% there. So it helps us to make progress, even though it wasn't perfect. And the other thing is, we could spend a lot of investment moving it from 80 to 90% and never recoup that investment, because there's not enough incremental value in that 10% improvement.
Right. That marginal return isn't there in that last 10%. And yeah, I've seen that with several technologies. Jeffrey, from your vantage point, what are the biggest opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years for generating value through innovation, whether that be in genetics, dairy breeding, or farm management?
I think we're going to see artificial intelligence continue to find its way into our operations in more and more ways, just like it does in our daily lives. So I see a lot of opportunity for artificial intelligence on our farms to help better utilize data, to help automate decisions and so forth. And that's going to help really take the next leap forward in all of this area. It doesn't come without its own questions and doubts. I'm certainly concerned about some things, and I'm not saying artificial intelligence is the end all be all, but it's really going to advance things very, very rapidly.
Yeah. And do you think small and mid-scale farms should engage those technologies and that AI adoption maybe differently than larger scale operations? Or do you think it's the same all across the board?
There are always differences in the way that small farms might look at something versus large farms. But I think for a small farmer to say that's not for me because I'm not big enough might be missing an opportunity. On the other hand, when you're dealing with smaller data sets, it's harder for artificial intelligence to pick up on patterns within data, or you might make a conclusion based on one outlier cow instead of based on 100 cows in a larger operation. So we have to be careful with how we interpret data on smaller operations, but data can be extremely valuable for small operations also. So I think it's a mistake to say this is not for small farms. It's just we might apply it or employ it a little bit differently on a small farm or a medium farm than what we would a large farm.
Now, in the technology development side, outside of software or AI insightfulness, where do you see the biggest opportunity moving forward? Is it in the visual technology, or do you think there's still a lot of barriers to that?
I think the biggest opportunity is looking at old data in new ways.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of opportunity to go back and question the way that we've looked at traditional herd management, DHI type data. and look at it in different ways with these tools. So I actually think that's probably the biggest opportunity, partly because I think the return on investment is potentially higher, because we don't have to invest in additional hardware to be able to do that. We're just utilizing some of the software tools that are available to us now. So I think that's the biggest opportunity. After that, when I think about where the technologies are headed, I think that the computer vision and milk analysis are the two biggest opportunities for us. I think there's going to be an explosion of technologies for using computer vision on farms that will help manage the operation better, and I think that's really, really exciting. The nice thing about that is you can take a camera, one piece of hardware to monitor a lot of animals. The downside to that is, like, sometimes I think we look at that, and I know I have fallen into the trap of looking at computer vision as, oh, it's going to be better than the wearables because of all these reasons. Well, it also comes with its set of problems. So it's not that it doesn't have challenges also. And one of the biggest challenges with that is keeping the cameras clean. So cameras do get dirty on farms. And like, we have one camera that sits in the eave of the barn, and we have a 30-foot pole that, like, people use to put light bulbs in, that we use to clean that camera. And it's not the easiest thing to do, but it does work. It's not the easiest to do. Or it's one of our challenges with our current system that we're working with, is just keeping the cameras clean is a challenge. So, and still rodents and bandwidth and all those sort of things can be challenges too with computer vision. And then the milk analysis, I look at the milking system where we harvest the milk as a place where we're collecting biological samples from our animals 2 to 6 times a day. And there's a huge opportunity to look at what we see in the milk. And, it's easy to see, okay, we can do fat percentage and protein percentage and maybe somatic cell count, but we could also expand that to look at reproductive hormones, look at other biomarkers of metabolic health. And I think there's a massive opportunity to better mine the data that's coming out of the milk on the individual animal also.
So you think that the sensory and the visual technology together will always make a better, more reliable picture on the farm for data generation?
Better than what?
Better than just going everything over to visual at some point.
I think it probably depends. Like the wearables, for example, they do work well, and they have their place. And also, we can't forget that sometimes the alternative is doing something manually or just going out and looking at the cow. And there's still value in those practices also. And then in the end, some of it comes down to the return on investment. So it might be that a camera system could be technically stronger, but maybe it's not less expensive and it's harder to justify for some reason economically. So there's a lot of factors that go in to say one's better than the other. And the other thing I will add is when I sit in technology talks and go to technology conferences, a lot of times I'll hear somebody ask a question, well, how do we get farmers to invest in more technologies? And that might be a student that's really interested in the area, or it might be a company that just wants to sell more of their technology. And I always cringe a little bit when I hear that question, because to me, we don't want to have a technology looking for a solution. We want to have a solution looking for a technology. So the question should be, at the individual farm level, is there a problem that a technology can help address? If not, we don't need a technology. We don't need a technology just for the sake of having a technology. Is it going to fill a need or a void or an opportunity on the farm? And it might be different for your farm than my farm or the neighbor's farm. It could be 3 completely different answers just because of our goals or our weak points in our operation.
Right. And then drilling down to the next question is, does that investment make sense, as you mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you had to predict 10 years from now, what will a top tier dairy farm look like in terms of how they collect their data, how they analyze their data, and make a decision on a day-to-day basis.
That it will continue to gravitate and will be more and more data driven, to the point that a lot of operations, particularly larger operations, will have a person or a few people that are just data people for the operation. There's so much data to mine that they'll have a chief information officer or somebody like that on the farm. It might not be that a 100-cow dairy does that, but it's enough that they might dedicate a quarter of somebody's time to work with the data, because there's so much that can be learned there. And, some of these opportunities that we see in data sets might be a 10 or 15% difference in profitability. And you uncover one little piece and it improves your profitability that much. Well, sometimes you're better off having somebody spend doing that than you are spending more on some other areas for human resources on the farm.
So producers who are listening to this, what would you say they should do to position themselves for the next wave of innovation? Is there something that they can do, even if they're not ready to invest or they're not ready to learn new systems? What are the things they can do today to get ready?
Partly just kind of be aware of what's out there and talk to other farmers about what they're seeing and what they're doing. And in the end, the best resource that I think farmers have for making some of these decisions is other farmers that are making the technologies work, or that have shown that they didn't work on their operation. So talking to other farmers, networking, keeping an eye on what's out there, maybe looking for smaller wins instead of the big win. So not every technology has to be a $50,000 or a $200,000 investment. There are some things that can be relatively inexpensive that maybe enter that. So like when I think about a house, for example, we have varying degrees of smart homes now, right? So we have lots of different technology. Well, the simplest thing might just be a plug, and a plug that you can say, "Hey Google, turn this light on," or "Turn this light off," or whatever, and that can be a view. Oh,
1 out of 2 lights on.
My Google just woke up and said,
"I'm going to leave that in there."
That's funny. But, for example, one of the things that we've done, like in all of my technology work, our first solution for every technology when it's not working is go unplug it and plug it back in and see if it works. Like that's always our first go-to. When I have a new employee and they say, "What do we do?" I said, the first thing you do is just unplug it and plug it back in. And it works at least half the time, if not more. Just like within our houses. Well, one time there was one that kept going off. And then I thought, well, I don't need to go down there physically to unplug this thing. I just need to get a smart plug and plug the smart plug in. And then I can from my phone, I can just click restart and it worked. So sometimes we have a $5 solution for an expensive problem.
No, that's a great story. So I know you mentioned a really good line that I think any startup or person in ag tech should understand, which is don't look for what was that? Don't look for a problem that, or don't look for a solution that doesn't have a problem, right?
Yeah.
But look for a problem on the farm that you can come up with a solution for, right?
Right.
So outside of that, what other advice would you give to a startup founder or ag tech entrepreneur that's trying to develop technologies in this space?
One would be to make sure and understand the farm system. Some of us that have spent our lives in that farm system, we understand how nosy cows can be, and if you leave a cable out, they will unplug it, and that sort of thing. So you've got to understand the cows, and you got to understand the system, the manure and moisture that's around, the extremes in temperature, and spend some time just listening to farms and farmers about how they manage their operation and watch cows. Just watch cows and listen to farmers. I see so many times where they skip right into the technical parts and they don't get some of those basics down, and then they have to go back later and try to fix those things because they didn't understand the system. And you know what? I think it's worthwhile hiring people that do understand that. So hiring somebody that has worked on a farm or managed a farm or owned a farm, as opposed to just having everybody that's an engineer, for example, on the team. That's huge. Another thing is to make sure to not overcomplicate things. Like in the end, simple works. Simple works better than complex. And the cow is still the most important piece of all of this. So we need to be thinking about the well-being of the animal and her natural behavior and how everything we do affects that. And not lose sight of that. And there's still a value in having people on the team that understand how to read cows and how to work around cows. There's still a human component to that. And there's a human component to working with the data also. So the people in the end are the key to making things work. And if the people don't buy in and they don't learn the system, then it's not going to be successful. So that's another important lesson. And spending the time to train people is extremely important. One of the things that I see happen a lot is that the training only occurs to the herd manager or the owner and not for the people that are actually doing the work. So it might be that it's more important to spend time training a milker or a calf feeder or whoever it is that's doing the actual work with the animals as opposed to the owner or the manager. Sometimes it's the same person, but those people need to be involved to make it work also.
Yeah, you really need that buy-in from everybody, right?
Yes.
Well, good. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for those great insights. Where can people find out more about what you're working on and what you're up to?
SmartHolstein.com is our website for the WKU Smart Holstein Lab, and you can follow that on Facebook or Instagram, and also follow the Holstein Association on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. We're constantly posting what we're doing with all those activities and beyond that for Holstein Association for sure.
Well, great. Well, thank you again so much for being here, Jeffrey. Really appreciate the insights.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks again for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. It was great to have you here this week. And as always, if you found this episode enlightening, please share it with somebody that you know that would also find it enlightening. We'd really appreciate that. That is how we grow our audience here at the AgCulture Podcast. And if you'd also be so kind as to leave a rating and review, we really appreciate that as well on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you want to check out some of the work and conferences that I'm speaking at, check out my personal website, paulwindemuller.com, and that will show you where I'm at in the world and some of the speaking that I'll be doing, as well as give you access to my Nuffield research paper. So with that, we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast.